Welcome to the Job Dream Podcast, where we discuss the best and worst parts of jobs with the people that actually work them. This is the best place to get an inside look at all different types of jobs to help you decide if it could be the dream job for you. Welcome back to another great episode of the Job Dream Podcast. Today we have a meta guest, Brandon Schexnayder. I say that because he is a professional podcaster, also an audio engineer, which is where he got his start. One of those few cases where he's known what he's wanted to do since he was, a young man. Started out in high school really just enjoying the music that he listened to and really thinking about it a lot deeper than a lot of people think about music, and knowing that in college he wanted to become an audio engineer. We learned about how you get your foot in the door at your first audio engineer studio, what kind of different career paths you can take once you get there, how you can, evolve into what he became as, a lead engineer, working with some really big names, George Strait, Miranda Lambert, he also the band Perry, Peter Frampton, helping others, win Grammys through his work. And then we learned about his, transition into podcasting, and how that was a different road of going from, behind the scenes to going in front of the camera. How he, used his love of history and ghost stories to really combine a new podcast that captures, the attention of millions of people. He got to number 23 in the Apple Podcasts, and he gives us even some tips on how we can make our podcast better. And if you want to become someone that as prolific as he is, I would say give it a listen, and you can always contact him. He will actually help you edit your podcast if you want, and we can learn tons from him. So without too much more talk by me, let's go ahead and get right into it. It's Brandon Schexnayder. The podcast he has are Southern Gothic and Southern Gothic Campfire Stories. Let's go ahead and give it a listen. And next up, Brandon Schexnayder. All right. Hey, Brandon Schexnayder. Thank you so much for being here. How are you doing today?
I'm doing well. Thanks for having me, Jordan.
Thanks for coming on. I just wanted to start off with your career path. So, usually we start with high school. Did you have any high school jobs? What kind of jobs did you do? And then we'll get going.
Sure. Yeah. Well, in high school, I worked at the minor league baseball stadium for pretty much the majority of high school and during the summers and all. I was a parking attendant, and that was kind of my summer job. And then moving into college, I went to college for music production, so I started working at CD stores.
Okay. And did you play music in high school, or when did that passion start?
I did. I was more a hobby. Well, I don't want to call it a hobbyist, but I wasn't out playing with the band or anything. I was a rock guy, so I was always kind of playing on my own and with groups and jamming, if you will, right?
Okay. And then you just love music, kind of that Tarantino route where he went and worked at a movie, uh, a DVD or
Right.
VHS store. You went for the CD store. What were you
Absolutely.
listening to back then?
Back then, I was listening to a lot of Pink Floyd. I was listening to a lot of heavy metal and blues, and I mean, I was very, very obsessed with music at that point in time, and I was more into the quality of recordings and the instrumentation and things like that, or at least as I was growing into college, was more interested in kind of that whole realm of not necessarily the instrumental and the players themselves, but how the whole, how it was all aggregated together, the production, if you will. Yeah.
Okay. Did you notice, like, amongst your friends that you were maybe hearing music differently than they were hearing it? Because I know, it's like, oh, that was a great song, but it sounds
Right.
like you were maybe breaking it down a bit further.
I was a lot more obsessed than they were. I'll tell you that.
Is that
The
is that
things that
listening to the
fired me up.
same thing over and over, or how do you
Well, I think the
explore that
things that I
obsession?
enjoyed would I was in a constant search, right? So I'm old enough. We had all those used Blockbuster musics and warehouse CDs, right? So I would go and just buy used CDs that I just thought the covers looked cool and things like that, and I would walk out with like $50 or something of bands that I might not have even known at that point or stuff that I had just heard of. And that was kind of how I would discover new music at that point was I wasn't going off recommendations or anything. I was just finding rabbit holes to go down and listening. And I kind of had I had a nice stereo at that point. I had saved up for some big nice speakers, so it gave me the chance to hear stuff in a different way than than a lot of my friends and all who were just listening to the car or listening on like boom boxes or something. Then.
Okay. And what about live music? Was that a draw for you?
No, actually, it was the opposite. I was so obsessed with this kind of production process, with this kind of music, and the way that this kind of this palette was used in the recording studio. I didn't really enjoy as much live music because it was different every time, I guess. I didn't like that vibe. I like that perfection, that production standpoint.
Okay. Yeah, I mean that tells a lot about your eventual career.
Right.
But yeah, kind of having that obsessive mentality. So, and what did you go to school for? You said you went to college.
Right. I went to college at Middle Tennessee State University, just south of Nashville, and I went for music production and technology. So I actually went up there and studied a little bit of music industry, legal music industry, things like that, as well as really focusing in on recording studios, learning a lot about digital audio and things like that. And I was right at the generation where I was probably one of the last group of people who was actually having to learn how to record onto reel-to-reel analog tape
Oh
at
wow.
that point in time. So I was kind of in that transitional period where when I came out in my career, I was able to still work on analog. And not that it's not done now. I mean, it's still done, but now it's a choice to do that, right? It's kind of an
Right.
artistic choice for folks to do it now. Back then, it was very much it was becoming a dinosaur. It was on its way out.
So you're kind of one of those rare people that really knew what they wanted, to do professionally and out of life at a pretty young age. I mean, besides the parking attendant, you pretty much
Huh.
always had a job in music of some kind.
Yeah, I definitely kept in this kind of deal. Now I did work. I will say I actually did work at a bookstore briefly. So out of college, I after college I was interning at a recording studio, and it wasn't paid. I take it back. I did get a paid gig at a recording. I had interned for a little while for a few months at a recording studio. After a few months, they offered me kind of a weekend job, right, where essentially you were like the front desk guy on the weekend during off hours, right, just so that way, just the cheesiest little job ever, where if folks were working in the recording studio and you were just buzzing them in and out of the building, right? And so
Okay.
very, very low paying job. And the way I was able to support myself, do that and work in the studio and everything is I did work at a bookstore part time as well. And that kind of help keep, help pay the bills while I kind of moved up through music.
But that was essentially your foot in the door. So you were buzzing people in, but you were at a recording studio knowing that eventually, you want to be behind, the
Right.
mixing tables and everything.
Yeah, that was kind of the only way in, and it's a very networked career. It's not a career that portion at least that portion of the production end. It's everyone's essentially a freelancer in some way, shape, or form. Now, there are some folks who will work at a studio and they'll be kind of hired hands, the folks that kind of take care of the equipment, things like that. But they're typically not in the sessions making the music, right? So. What you would do is you might work at one of these studios, and I was hired by the studio for a good bit of time, and at that point you're kind of networking with everybody there. You're showing people how to use the equipment there. Maybe you're just helping troubleshoot things like that. And as you kind of develop more of a network, then you might get asked to go and work on some sessions. You might get asked to go work on an album, something like that. And that's kind of how I came up. Is I was there as what would be called like a house guy for a little while, helping people set up sessions, things like that. One day, a friend of mine who was working for a gentleman that was a gentleman who's a very, very large producer engineer. His name was Chuck Ainlay. He had done a lot of very big records. He engineered a bunch of George Strait records, Mark Knopfler, I mean, just an immense, a very, very big name engineer. Well, a friend of mine who was his assistant at this point had another opportunity of his own for himself to go engineer and leave this assistantship. And that's when I got my first kind of break. There was I was working for this studio, and Chuck knew me from being meticulous in that point, and basically said, hey, would you come work on this album with me? And I went and worked on that album and kind of grew from there. And that was that foot in the door from there to kind of go from essentially what was like a computer fixer guy at the studio to actually working in on recording sessions.
Okay. And before that, so you're graduating college, you have a degree, and you know how to use all this equipment. How did you get the first like door buzzer job? I mean, because it's so much
Right.
networking, how did you
Yeah.
get that very initial, window in?
My my particular instance was I had a friend who was there and
Okay.
they said that they were looking. So I just went ahead to this studio and I knew that there were some folks that were at this studio that were fairly large names, right? Now, a lot of my friends that are in the industry and all, at that point in time, they just everybody would just go and they would shotgun approach it, trying to get a get an internship somewhere. Might apply for the internships, might just email, ask, things like that, and just end up places. I was lucky enough to where I already had a friend that was there, and they knew they were looking. So yeah,
Excellent. Okay. I mean, I think that's important to know that, networking is really important when it comes to especially these types of jobs, and then already
right,
having the skill set, knowing that you're doing something that is a little bit below you and you know how to use the equipment, but just hoping to get that first opportunity
right.
where you can prove it, being recognized as someone that, has that meticulous nature to them, and then getting that very first chance to be on a recording. Is that where we are now?
That's absolutely yeah. The music production world and music in general is all things being equal, you're going to hire your friend.
Right.
So as many friends as you can have, as many people you can click with, vibe is a big deal in that world too, So really getting along and doing that. And I don't say that to discourage anyone who feels like, well, I don't fit in. I say that it is as in like there's different tribes even within that, and you kind of navigate towards the kind of folks who work the way you do, who have the same interest as you, and you really kind of network and foster that community in there. And that's how you can grow from out of that for sure. Yeah.
Okay. And take us through like what a day kind of looks like when you're in that first recording. Like what are you
Mm.
showing up whenever they want, and what does that schedule look like, and what does the actual work look like?
As an assistant?
Yeah.
Yeah. As an assistant, essentially what the job was to make sure that everything technical worked so that the engineer you were working for could focus on the more artistic decisions. Okay. So essentially what I would do is if we were going to have a live band recording, so we're going to have, a 6, 7 piece band or something in this day, and we're going to track the full band all at once. Here in Nashville, they still do that. They still have, big live bands being recorded. And what essentially that engineer would do is he'd make the decision on all the microphones that were going to be used, which pieces of equipment were being used, all the artistic decisions that would go with this. And it would essentially be as an assistant, it would be your job to kind of go in, set that up, test everything, make sure everything's working because this is a lot of wires. This is there's something goes wrong nonstop in this scenario. There's a lot of variables running with this equipment, whether it's even just buzzes on microphones. I mean, this is the Zoom generation. The best thing I can say is that right now, when you sit down at a Zoom and somebody's like, "Man, my mic's not working. Can you hear me? Can you hear me?" Imagine if I had 40 microphones out at once, right? So your job was to essentially make sure that all of this worked. Everything came in loud and clear. So that way, when the engineer came in, he could sit down, make his own creative adjustments to what this, template, I guess you might call it, set. And so when the band came in, he didn't have to worry about whether or not the car was running. He could just race it. I would say that's probably the best thing. So
Okay.
philosophically speaking, I like to say it's make technology transparent so people can make music. You know,
Yeah, take away all the obstacles so they can just get in, do what they need to do. And that's
totally.
at every level. So at the very base level, it's let's make sure everything's plugged in, everything's crisp. So what time does a band usually come in? How much earlier do you usually
Sure.
get in there? And then what does like a payday look like? What is it? Is it
Yeah.
by job? Is it by day?
Well, in that particular scenario, so as an assistant here in Nashville, the majority of these sessions, if you're in the country world, if you're up on Music Row, they're all union members. They're all part of the
Oh,
union here, the music union. So essentially, a session would either be at 10, 2, or 6 o'clock. All right. And you would have these set times that they would work. Okay. So if you have a 10, a downbeat at 10, you might be in depending on if you've set up the night before, normally you'd kind of set up the night before and probably come in at 9 and recheck everything real quick, make sure everything's turned on. A setup for that the night before a band, it might be just depending on how large it is, anywhere from like 2 to 5 hours, depending on how meticulous, how much different equipment you might be using, things like that. Payday wise, typically it was by the day. You're freelancing, right? So you're freelancing, so it's it kind of comes down to how wanted are you in that scenario as to what your rate is. Okay, so if you are working for someone who commands a higher rate, then chances are you can command a higher rate at that point, on how you bill or things like that. It's all of that's kind of negotiated on a per project basis for engineers.
Okay. And then from being the assistant, how do you transition into the lead engineer role?
Sure, it's all networking. It is all
Okay.
networking. It's kind of the same deal. It's just at some point, maybe you just start getting asked by someone in there if you'd come work on a project with them. It's not a very formal. None of this is really very formal in any way. There's not really a route. You might be that not even an assistant yet, and you might just be doing some projects with a local songwriter on your laptop in the front lounge of the studio, and that songwriter ends up getting a deal, and the next thing you know, you might be engineering that record, skipping the assistant stage. So it's very much, like I said, a network type position. You don't necessarily have to go that traditional route to get to engineer. I was fortunate, and in doing what I did, is I got to learn a lot from a master engineer. Very much got to learn, not even just the process of it, but had an opportunity to really hone my ears and really understand what it was I was hearing. So the craft itself really got beat into me before I had to concern myself with the business portion that I did as an actual engineer, or once I moved into kind of the next role.
Okay, and go a little bit deeper into the business portion. So after you get
Sure.
kind of lucky enough to learn everything about it, what comes next? What more responsibilities are you taking on?
Sure. Well, most of us are freelance, like I said, so you're an independent contractor at that point. So you're kind of finding clients, you're sourcing clients. Most of the guys I know around here in Nashville, they typically have kind of one or two anchor clients, which might be like a producer that hires them about half the time. So that way they kind of know that they have a set amount of work that they might be doing, or have somebody that they rely on, somebody who's really got a lot of work. um, Usually it's producers that will be hiring you, not the musicians themselves. Those musicians, or those producers, are typically the ones finding the projects in the first place, or maybe they're the record labels or sending artists to these producers, and the producers are the ones that are hiring you. So when it comes to the business itself, I think that the main difficulty is you're doing a craft where you are essentially expected to be a hermit in a recording studio working on things, but at the same time, you need to be making sure that you have another project in the pipeline, coming up next, because you could sit there for a month, not meet anyone else while you're honing in on a project, not talk to anyone else, and really be focused in on getting an album out. And then you come out of that and realize, well, I haven't really set anything else up. I haven't even put anything else in motion. At the same time, you're typically, I mean, you're doing all your own invoicing, all the things like that. So you're 100% an independent contractor for the most part as an engineer. Some folks do also, it's very common around here now, especially with the way that technology has changed so much, is um, people own their own places now. So they'll have their own studios, whether or not it's a kind of at their homes or whether or not it's a commercial facility. A lot of people do that as well. And that kind of brings in another level of clientele and another level of kind of business savvy that you need in order to keep it all functioning and operating.
And do you ever have your own kind of studio, or are you always traveling to either theirs or like a mutual agreed upon
Right.
place.
I myself, I have had a little mix room before where I would essentially mix demos and do post production and do editing and things like that. I've never owned a place where I have had people come record. I've just never really been that interested in that part. I kind of grew up not really wanting the keys to a recording studio. I always like going elsewhere. As I've kind of traditioned over, or excuse me, transitioned into the podcasting world, it's a lot less necessary to have as much of the bells and whistles. So, what I myself have is I have essentially a room that is treated very well for listening rather than recording.
Okay, because that is kind of the more important part where you're making those adjustments is
Right.
listening back to what's going on. All right, that makes a lot of sense. And talking about that transition, what was the reason that you? I mean, you've worked with like George Strait, and a
Yeah.
lot of big names. I think it's Marissa Lambert. Is that her name?
Miranda
Miranda
Lambert. Yeah.
Lambert.
Yeah.
I did listen to one of her songs. Not necessarily my type of music, but Keith
Sure.
Urban, Leanne Womack, Peter Frampton. I mean Bob
Uh-huh.
Seger. These are obviously Cyndi Lauper, huge names,
Yeah.
and getting a lot of great experience with them and winning some awards. For helping them make some amazing songs. What decides hey, I kind of want to look into something else.
Life balance, to be honest. At the end of the day, it was a very demanding career. I enjoyed it. I still enjoy doing music a lot. There was a level of, my oldest daughter basically grew up in the recording studio, and I was kind of getting tired of that. Wanted to be around a little more. This is why a lot of guys will build studios at their house so they can be around more. But there was a little bit of that. There was a little bit of, well, more than anything, I'll be honest, more than anything, you know, I I was fascinated with when podcasting came out. So if you've ever heard Radio Lab,
That was, I think,
um,
one of the first I ever listened to.
I
Yeah, I think that
mean,
was
yeah,
a big one for everybody.
yeah, I mean, Radio Lab, just what they did with sound. And I remember being in the studio, being in one of these studios down here, one of these really nice studios where, and I was setting up for something, and I threw Radio Lab up on these speakers. And I mean, these speakers there were ATCs. Gosh, I don't even remember how big the woofers were, but I mean, you're talking about $50,000 speakers,
Oh
and a
wow.
Radio Lab up there, and Radio Lab was just like nothing else. The way they, experimented with sound and all. And I'm sitting there listening, and it sounded the way like an album was. It was these guys understood that, speakers and these earbuds and all that they were. It's a blank palette. It's a blank artistic palette for storytelling, and it just absolutely floored me and fascinated me. And I just for years wanted to do something like that, and was interested in that. And podcasting felt like the Wild West at the time. Nobody really knew what they were doing. And a lot of the music I was doing at that point was songwriters and country and Americana, and a lot of my best friends were songwriters. So there's a lot of storytelling that I was consuming a lot of storytelling from different angles at that point. Um, yeah, it was a more creative path for me. It was a way to satiate the creative appetite that I had, that being just an engineer and making someone else's record would, because most of the time, I guess what I was doing as an engineer would be akin to building someone else's house, right? Here's the plans, here's where we want it. Now, can you make this as nice of a house as possible? And that's what an engineer is making an album. You're making creative decisions, but at the end of the day, the path is pretty well set. You're working for somebody else. When I kind of transitioned into podcasting and making my own podcasts and producing my own stuff, it gave me this blank palette to explore a lot more. It gave me the opportunity to do things that I thought were interesting, to tell stories of my own, to do things like that. And that's that's really what I think drew me to it the most, was having that opportunity to be creative in a way that I didn't know a lot of people were yet.
Excellent. And yeah, I think, podcasts like Radio Lab, especially for someone like you, after hearing your podcast, they do more. a full experience. I listen to some of your podcasts and it has the rain going and a lot of different effects that kind of make it a full immersive experience. When you're first kind of creating, your first podcast, are you thinking I'm going to be the one on the mic, or I'm just going to, help other people tell their stories, or what was,
Right.
your first kind of transition? Like, how did you say, now that I want to do a podcast, I see what can be done. What are you going to do to, make yours?
Right. Well, I had no idea what I was going to do to start. I had helped a friend at one point make one where they kind of just had a traditional route of interview style. It didn't really last all that long. Um, and I just helped them kind of make a good, clean, crisp one, right? Make one that actually sounded good. This was before kind of the let's say Serial, when if you remember that the podcast
Mhm.
Serial came out, and that was the game changer in podcasting. When Serial came out, all of a sudden there was kind of a mad rush of people to make podcasts, right? You figure that and the pandemic are really been the two major markers for podcasting, as to when the number of podcasts and the kind of growth of it as an industry. And these guys were making one before Serial, and um, it was just generic, cut and dry. But it did make me realize how easy it was. It taught me in general, seeing them do it, how wild west it was, how I could get away with anything, how this is basically, tell people now. I mean, what we're recording right now. I mean, we could have this in everybody's pocket that follows you in the next 20 minutes if we want to, right? That's a
Yeah.
that's a that's an incredibly powerful format. At the same time, we could take what we're talking about right here and we could go spend the next 3 weeks and we could craft everything around it and make it this huge, surround sound experience with the way technology is now. Um, so that's what kind of, that's really what drew me to it. As for the topic itself, I think I kind of went with what aesthetically I wanted. I toyed with a few things. I knew I was going to be in the history world. I knew it was going to be a narrative. I knew, it wasn't going to be an interview that I did. It was definitely going to be a narrative. I didn't really want to be the one talking, but I wanted to make one so bad, and I wasn't going to wait on anyone else. Um, and yeah, and that's kind of how I ended up there. It fit my aesthetic. It fit a lot of my interests. The topic we're on. Um, in many ways, I say now, 4 or 5 years later, the what Southern Gothic is, that podcast that I made. Um, I almost, in a lot of circles and in a lot of the way it's kind of put me in a different niche, it's almost like I've transitioned even in a totally different career now, because now I I live in a lot of weird paranormal circles. So it's like I'm not it's I have kind of a whole separate little career and identity in this world that has nothing to do even with podcasting or audio, because I've become such an expert in the subject while making a podcast. And that's been really interesting as well.
And I don't know where you're living now, but you grew up in New Orleans, right?
Yep, New Orleans, born and raised, and I'm right south of Nashville now, right in a town called Franklin, Tennessee.
Excellent. Okay. Because I
Uh,
know I've been in New Orleans a couple times, and I think for a lot of people who maybe have never been there, is not knowing that it is such a ghost, or kind of
yeah,
like there's so many of these kinds of stories, voodoo type, like fascinating stories about so many different places there. Is that kind of like you grew up listening to ghost stories and campfire stories, or how
yeah.
did you kind of first get interested in that?
Well, you're right. That town is just absolutely. It is steeped in lore. It doesn't matter what you do or where you go. You just you feel it while you're down there. It feels like that. I think a lot of what pushed me there, there's certainly a lot of elements and things that, looking back, whether it was, my mom watching too much X Files or not, right? My parents were really big into genealogy, and this is back before the internet. And so they drug us to cemeteries all the time and libraries because, they were going and they were researching. And, at that point in time, you didn't have ancestry.com. you go look for tombstones to find out information for your family trees, and so I spent a lot of time in cemeteries as a child and
Wow.
growing up in New Orleans and that. And so it kind of, it gave me a comfort level and an interest in some of these kind of more, I guess you could call them macabre things, or something like that, kind of darker nature, or that. So it was a pretty natural progression. It definitely, that kind of swamp vibe is definitely lives inside my bones for sure.
And now you're telling stories, but they are historically accurate, I would assume. Where are you getting your information now? How has that kind of
Right.
changed from the library days?
Sure. Yeah. Well, the what we do now essentially is we tell ghost stories, and we usually talk about ghost stories. I promote it as, it's every little small town in the South has ghost stories, and you probably heard them from your mama, right? But what's the
Sure.
truth behind them? What isn't? Your grandmother, your whoever you heard them growing up. And so what we do is we'll take one of those little stories and we will go and just research, as much as possible out of it. And my sister is actually, she's an archivist down at the Louisiana State Museum, and she's my partner on Southern Gothic because she's a professional researcher. And we'll go back there, we'll look at the context of the story. We'll look at if people in the story are true or false, if they actually were living. We'll really try and nail down with the story itself what's true, what isn't. We'll try and nail down what the most honest telling of the tale is versus what the legend is. And we really are interested in is taking these stories and looking at how they evolved over time. So if there's a story that's about an antebellum plantation that's been passed down for centuries, right? Well, we kind of look at how it evolved all the way to what you might now see, the guys on Ghost Adventures butchering or something on TV. And we kind of look at it that way in this kind of historical context. It's it's kind of part history. It's part history, part folklore, part anthropology, part paranormal, to be honest. So it kind of jumps into a little bit of a multiple disciplinary thing,
Excellent. And one of the things I really liked about your podcast is that production value, like you were saying, Radio Lab. But you do put in all these kind of effects. And I just want, maybe some tips to the listeners and of course me. What are some ways to kind of ramp up the everyday podcast, or how do you,
Sure.
kind of, is there something you can buy or something, maybe that's cost effective to really get that production to the next level?
Well, I would say listen. I would say just start. Your ears are the most important thing ever, right? So I know this isn't the advice everybody wants, but but really focusing in on listening and learning what it is that a professional sound is, because um, if someone, someone that understands what it's supposed to sound like is going to be able to make a professional recording on amateur gear. It might not be their best work. They might complain about it, right? But if you were to give me a stock equalizer to work on your voice, and you had a $500 plug-in EQ, I still feel like I could probably make a better product with the $25 plug-in that came in, right? And so I think it's a matter of really focusing on listening well, paying attention to what it is, and learning the tools, and whether those tools are in GarageBand or whether they are in Studio One or whatever you use, and really pay attention. It's a time thing. It's a craft. It's something that you have to practice. Learning those tools and knowing what a compressor does is more important probably than knowing what settings everybody uses, right? Um, that being said, there is a lot of great amateur stuff. Or I don't even want to call it amateur anymore. There's a lot of great products out there that will get you 90% of the way there. There's a lot of stuff, I with interview podcasts, when I edit for people, I do other people's productions still as a freelancer. I'll still help edit for other folks and make a little side money, doing productions for other people. And if somebody like yourself were to do it, I actually use a service on the back end called Auphonic. Okay. And it's a program that will essentially, it will do the main work of what compression and EQ would do otherwise, and it'll get me about 80% of the way there. And that way I don't have to spend quite as much time. So there are great products, but the only way you can know if those products are butchering your audio or making it better is if you really focus on what you listen to. You know, your ears at the end of the day are going to be your best tools for sure.
Okay. I think that is really good advice. Definitely the advice people don't want to hear because of how much work that takes. But I
Yeah.
think that's the point. I mean, I think when you listen to your podcast, you can tell that you really put the time in. And it really it shows, it's very besides, I mean, you having a great podcasting voice. I don't know if you've always had that, but um it comes off very warm and, intriguing as you listen to yours. The last thing I kind of want to touch on before we get out of here is just, once you have your podcast, how do you grow it? How do you get more people to listen to it?
Yeah.
How do you've done all the work, now what?
That's the $1 million question, isn't it? Um, I tell people, as if day one I would have looked at where I'm at now, 5 years later, I would have been both disappointed and excited, right? So depending on what you're doing, I think it's really evaluating what it is you need. I very much for is what your goal is to begin with is a very important point. Do you need to win a niche and only need 100 listeners, but it's a very specialized niche that you're an expert in, or do you need 20,000 listeners an episode? And the advice is different for both, but I would say that the most important thing you can do is be where your listeners are. And I mean that in if you are, I mean, just doing interviews like this, just having these opportunities, making sure you're on that podcatcher that they're on. Things like that are important. I think networking with other people is probably the most important. Um, you can find all the little tips and tricks online, but having people to talk to and a network of people to really, converse with and grow it that way. I think at the end of the day, that's given me the largest jumps. Those collaborations with other people, that's really made the biggest difference in listenership for sure.
Okay, very similar to when you were first getting started in the music industry, and holding true to the same values of, meeting people that are like-minded and helping it grow that way. So that's fantastic.
Yeah.
The podcast that you have is Southern Gothic, as well as Southern Gothic Campfire Stories. Is there anything else you want to share or, help promote?
No, but I am always taking clients, helping other folks edit and all. So if anyone's ever interested in and getting some assistance, some consulting, or any work on their own podcasts, I'm always open to chatting and see if we might be a good fit that way. I know there's a lot of people looking for help out there. There's a lot of different podcasts out there, and I really enjoy learning as much as I can about the industry from other people too. So please reach out if you're a podcaster as well. Yeah.
And what would be the best way for them to reach out to you?
Sure. You can go to southerngothicmedia.com, or you can email me directly. My email is storyteller at southerngothicmedia.com. Or if you really want to go for it and try it, there is brandonschexnayder.com. If you really want to go after the whole, I'm trying to spell that right there, but that's my personal page there, brandonschexnayder.com.
You got the New Orleans X in there, so I'll let our listeners figure out where they can place that X.
Yeah, all the
Um,
letters.
but yeah, Southern Gothic Media is probably the easiest place. Well, yeah, thank you so much, Brandon, for coming on. Really appreciate it, and I wish you the best of luck. And hopefully down the road, our podcast can get to somewhere near, where yours is topped out at number 23. But I really thank you for taking the time with us today.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me, Jordan.
All right, you have a good day. Bye.
You too.